Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast delving into one issue facing Israel and the Jewish world. I'm Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan. Shortly after October 7th, when the murderous Hamas onslaught on southern Israel sparked the war in Gaza, Israel was pulled into defending itself and fighting Iran or its proxies on 7 fronts: Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, the West Bank, and of course, Iran. But there is an 8th front that has emerged, and it's no less pernicious: the battle for public opinion and legitimacy. Since the war broke out, Israel advocate Aviva Klompas has used her robust social media platforms to provide a counter to the onslaught of anti-Israel hate. As co-founder and CEO of Boundless, Aviva says that she aims to reshape Israel education and confront antisemitism head-on. This war is affording her great opportunity to do so. We speak about this and her new book in a conversation in our Jerusalem offices. So this week, we ask Aviva Klompas, what matters now? Aviva, thank you so much for joining me today in our Jerusalem office.
It is my pleasure and an honor. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is all mine, believe me. We're here, of course, to discuss your new book, Standup Nation, Israeli Resilience in the Wake of Disaster. But also, I just really want to hear about how this past year has been for you. So to begin with, tell us a little bit about how you would describe your work in this past year.
I think really the story begins before this past year. It's actually the origin story for my new book as well, which is about 10 years ago, I served as the speechwriter for Israel at the United Nations under Ambassador Ron Prosor. And looking back, that was an incredibly formative experience in many different ways. It's colored really my entire professional life, but also more importantly, my outlook, and very much so in this war. When I used to serve as the speechwriter for Israel at the UN, people would often ask me, why does Israel put up with the unrelenting bias, anti-Israel bias at the United Nations? And it's a fair question because no country has to be a member of the United Nations. It's a choice. And more than that, to be a member in good standing, you have to pay dues, which Israel does. So it pays to endure the sort of abuse that we routinely see. And as much as I was asked that question by many people, it was never a topic of conversation inside of the delegation. And the reason is, it never occurred to us for a moment that Israel has anything but every right to participate in and contribute to global affairs. And that's just what I believe to the very core of my being, both about Israel, but also about the Jewish people. We have every right to be treated equally like every other people. And so very much for me this past year, what I've seen play out, particularly in the news, particularly on social media, has left me feeling indignant. And my outspoken voice is very much a response that says, no, I'm not going to tolerate statements that speak about sympathy for dead Jews, but then deny us the right to protect ourselves. In reality, I'm not interested in meaningless statements. It's absolutely clear that if it was roving mobs on campuses targeting any other minority group, it would have been shut down on day one. It's so clear that we're being othered, and that's constantly what I'm speaking out about.
And you use your voice on a variety of social media platforms, for sure, but how do you know that your message actually makes a difference?
Well, if we're being honest, I don't. So there's a few points to that. First of all, my full-time job is as the CEO and co-founder of an American nonprofit called Boundless that I co-founded alongside my good friend Dr. Rachel Fish 3 years ago. Boundless is a think action tank. Our focus is on Israel and antisemitism in the realm of both education and both in terms of what's happening in the narrative war. Most of my time is spent on the narrative war, both studying what is happening on social media that makes this not a fair fight in any way, but also looking at how we can improve our communications. One of the things we do is public opinion polling of American audiences. Thanks to research done by Boundless, I have good insights into what Americans know and believe about Jews, about Israel, and about this war. And that certainly helps to inform my public voice on social media, also in op-eds and in speaking and so forth. The second piece of it is when I'm speaking out, as I said, it's not really driven by engagement. I never go back and read the comments, and I don't read my DMs, much to many people's frustration. And that's because one of the things I know as a researcher, and it's according to SIABRA, which is an Israeli-based organization, 1/4 of the conversation on social media about this war is inauthentic activity, meaning bots. There's a 1 in 4 chance you're arguing with a bot. My baseline assumption, this is not entirely true, but in my head, I always put something out, and then the people that are responding, I'm like, it's a bot or it's Hamas. And I have no interest in engaging with either of them. And so I continue. And really what I'm doing is I'm using my voice publicly. In terms of whether I believe that social media is changing or shaping public opinion, that's difficult to say. And the reason is that engagement tools that we can look at easily on social media, so views, impressions, retweets, shares, things like that, they don't tell us anything about what we really care about. Ultimately, what we care about is what people know, what people believe, and how people behave. And the engagement or impression numbers that you see on social media won't tell you anything about that. But what I do know is that very often people will come to me in real life and say to me, I'm Jewish, and because you use your voice in the world, I feel a little bit less alone and a little bit less scared. And if that's all that I'm doing, I feel it's a lot.
That's so, everything you just said is so remarkable to me. Of course, as any kind of journalist knows, the comments are poison for the most part. Don't ever read the comments, but I'm just so curious. I often will read the comments. So when you're putting something out there, you're just saying to yourself, I stand by this. This is what my truth is, what the truth is. I'm putting it out into the world and setting it free.
It's exactly what I think. And again, I think that's a mentality that was born from my time in the United Nations, where partially because there's a huge amount of bias, but it's also simply the amount of information that's coming at the UN. When I was there, it was during the Iran deal, and it was during the 50 days of war between Israel and Hamas, which at the time felt like a lot. There was so much going on, and I had to produce so much writing and so much public communication that I actually got used to the notion of you prepare it and you put it out and then you move on to the next thing. And certainly we've seen in the course of this war, there is something happening, not just every day, but a few times a day. And so I'm on to the next thing. It actually surprises me sometimes. People will say, that tweet really bothered me, or I really liked it. And I'm like 500 tweets from there. So I've moved on.
Well, that's really, really good for me to hear, and actually a good dose of perspective for me to learn from. But when you're tweeting out your information, often you're extremely quick, maybe even faster than the Times of Israel. So how do you know which sources to trust when you're pushing something out?
I try really hard to find quality, credible sources. So sometimes it's from individuals that I know that are sharing information. Sometimes it's from other outlets. And I'd say there's two things going on. One, I have a pretty good algorithm and human network. And the second thing is I don't always get it right. But again, going back to a time where I really had to absorb information, filter it fast, and then push something out, it's just a honed skill at this point.
And are there any points that you've gotten things wrong and you've really regretted the speed versus taking a step back and breathing deeply?
Of course, I've gotten things wrong. And it wasn't necessarily because it was fast. It was because I trusted a source. And there's an element of human error always, both in me and in other people. And with the sheer quantity of what I put out, it's inevitable that some of it will be wrong. And when I do, I try to correct the record or delete it so it won't continue to spread.
You are in a field that I would call hasbara, which is not journalism, but many people mix these two fields up. So give me your definition of hasbara, or what you're doing.
It's funny because I don't use that phrase myself. People will also sometimes call me an influencer, and I won't use that also. I explained why, because we can't really tell from social media the extent of our influence. And again, the advocacy, it always sounds to me like it's being done on behalf of. But very much when I'm using my voice, it's because these are my principles. This is what I believe. And the sort of statements in that respect. And that's how I see it.
So how would you consider your principles at this point vis-a-vis the state of Israel or the government of Israel?
very much in line with what I said, which is Israel and the Jewish people have every right to be treated equally, to participate in and contribute to global affairs.
But that doesn't mean you're a spokesperson for the government, essentially.
Of course not.
Right. Or the IDF or any other body.
Absolutely not. But I look at what's happening in the world. I look at biased media headlines. I look at the triple standard that's applied to Israel. This is something Ambassador Ron Persor used to say at the United Nations when I worked there, which is in global affairs, it's not a double standard, it's a triple standard. There's one standard for the dictatorships and the authoritarian regimes. There's another standard for democracy. And then there's this third impossible standard set for the state of Israel alone. And that's really what I'm speaking out against.
When I look at your Twitter feed, I see a mix of fact and also a human element. And I wonder if you have any sense, you don't read your comments or your DMs, as you said, but I wonder if you have a sense of what penetrates more.
I know this from doing research on social media. So not specific to my account, but in general, the rule on social media is if it enrages, it engages. This is why I always say that social media is a terrible forum for education, and yet it is the forum where many people are getting an education. In education, you want to be nuanced. You want to have critical thinking skills. You want to have multiple perspectives. You want to be even-tempered. This is not what social media rewards. This is not what will gain traction and be spread. I always liken social media a little bit like to the Colosseum in ancient Rome, which is that you have people battling it out in the center of the arena, and then you have the crowds lustily cheering them on in this really battle to the death. That is not a forum in which anybody can have a reasonable conversation and look at multiple perspectives, but that really is what's rewarded on social media because it is a business model. Enrage will get more eyes, more traction, and more eyes, and the longer you spend looking at your screen is more money for the platforms themselves.
The last time you and I interacted was virtually, other than setting the date for this interview. And that was when you posted, very kindly reposted one of our Those We Have Lost individuals. And this is a project, an ongoing project that we have where we're trying to create a personal portrait of every single person who was murdered on October 7th and died in the ensuing war. And I wonder, when you're posting content from various different sources, how much at that interaction, I'll just lift the veil, was me asking you, hey, could you also include a link to this project? Because I really wanted to have people read it. And I wonder, when you're picking and choosing your different items to post, how much do you feel compelled to credit the source and to draw the people to the original site?
So first of all, that's an incredibly important site that you're building and continuing to maintain. And I think it's so important because the sheer scale of who we lost on October 7th and in the almost year since is just, it's impossible to wrap your head around. And being able to take that time to see this person through the eyes of the people who loved them is so very important to share and to be able to read about. In those first months after the war, there was so much information and I think a state of shock. There are large periods of time in the beginning where it's hard for me to remember what was happening. And there was just vast amounts of information. And I really wanted to share the stories. And I found it to be an amazing resource. And certainly I try my best to give credit where credit is due. And sometimes I need to be reminded, and I'm always happy to do so.
There is, of course, just recently a similar situation with a very famous, in Israel at least, cartoonist who had a series of cartoons which were just fantastic and encapsulating the walkie-talkie/pager attacks against Hezbollah, which Israel allegedly committed. And it was just these snapshots of Nasrallah. Her name is, I believe, Donna Barev. And there was a bit of a tussle on Twitter. And I found it really exciting, actually, to see how the crowd was really advocating for her to get her credit where credit was due. And I wonder if you've ever had that kind of interaction with people in terms of the things that you're posting as well.
I remember the interaction you're talking about. The cartoonist, who's incredibly talented, put up a post saying that some other person had shared it. It had reached over 1 million views and she didn't get credit. And the second I saw that, it wasn't me that had posted it, but the second I saw it, my heart went out to her. And then I posted about it and drove people to her site. So again, social media moves fast and I'm always looking forward rather than backwards. But I do try my best to try to amplify those voices and to point out talent and recognize good work when it's done.
So we were just talking about a woman in particular, and I have found in my work that women's voices are not necessarily even suppressed, but maybe sometimes women suppress their own voices out of a feeling of inadequacy, or that they're not the biggest expert to talk about certain things. And I wonder if you yourself had to overcome that kind of feeling to build your huge, huge platform that you have.
It's interesting. I never really thought about it in that respect. I can tell you that people will sometimes ask us why Rachel and I chose to name our nonprofit Boundless. It doesn't have a J in it. It's not an acronym. It's a very unusual name for a Jewish organization. And the answer is there was a few reasons behind it. The first was that we really wanted it to be out of the box, expansive thinking that said, we don't want to be driven by kishkas. We want to be data-driven, and we wanted to put all options on the table and really be able to think about things in unusual ways. But another major driver in the name Boundless was that there would be no glass ceiling. We're two women who founded this organization and run the organization, and we believe that what we can achieve is limitless.
And are you finding in your work as well that you're discovering other like-minded women?
Particularly in Israel, absolutely. And particularly in the last year, there's been incredible women who have led civil society activities or doing work in all sorts of data science or education projects. And so most definitely, yes. But I think to some degree, you're right. You have to be willing to step forward, and you can't wait for somebody else to invite you to the table. You kind of have to elbow your way in yourself.
Let's talk about your book a little bit, which unfortunately I confess to you, I have not had a chance to read. The news has just
Has it been busy in the news?
It's been a little busy in the news recently.
Fair
and so
enough.
I feel like really a student who's turning in just nothing on the day the assignment is due. But it's called Standup Nation. And of course, you mentioned to me, who was the first person to write you a recommendation in the book?
Dan Senor. So obviously Standup Nation is a riff off the very famous book Startup Nation. And we all know that Israel is the startup nation because its incredible innovations and its technological prowess. And what people don't know is this lesser known story of Israel's history in outreach to developing nations. And that's really this story that I've written about. Again, the origins of this book go back 10 years to when I was the speechwriter for Israel at the United Nations, where there was, again, so much to be written, so much to be done. I was responsible for all English language communication, so much more than speeches, letters, op-eds, social media posts, that I didn't have a great deal of time to devote to any given assignment. But when it came time to write speeches with respect to international development, I would find myself falling down this rabbit hole reading about things that I found fascinating. Israel's pioneering years, the audacity of Israelis, stories about Golda Meir. And I thought to myself, how is it that more people don't know this story? Which is that in Israel's earliest years, it was a developing nation. It was desperately poor. It was fighting these wars against its neighbors. It was fighting for its survival. It had this enormous influx of refugees, and they were mostly Holocaust survivors or refugees from Arab nations. And so the state had to provide really everything for them, housing and food and job training and language training. And so people were being placed in ma'abarot, which were absorption camps. They were living in essentially wooden or tin shanty towns without running water, without proper hygiene. And it was not the land of milk and honey as described in the Bible. You had swampy, malaria-ridden lands along the coast, rocky, dry, arid in the west and in the south of the country. And it's in this context that Israel goes and founds an international development agency. And essentially what happens is Golda Meir becomes foreign minister. And she looks around at the situation in the world. It's not altogether different from the situation that we find ourselves in today, which is that Israel is isolated. It's fighting for its survival. It doesn't have a lot of friends. It's being punished economically, legally, militarily. And she says, we have to do something about this. And she looks at the world, and about 1/4 of the United Nations composition at the time were states from Africa. And this is when decolonization was sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa. Country after country was gaining its independence and joining the UN. And Israel had just sent an ambassador into one of the newly born African countries, and he invited Golda Meir to come on a tour. And she went on a tour of 5 different countries, and she was this huge success. She was a sensation. Both diplomats and ordinary people loved her. And she returned to Israel, and she went to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, and she said to him, we need to do something. When I look at these countries, I see a situation that's very similar to our own. We're both about the same age. We both emerged from under the thumb of colonialism. We're both dealing with dry and arid farming conditions. The difference is that we, Israel, are going to build ourselves out of this, and we're going to be an enormous success. And as we do that, I want to share our knowledge and our abilities with other nations. And she's a persuasive woman, and she convinces him to found Mashav, which is Israel's Agency for International Development Cooperation. This is when Israel is 10 years old. It's still a developing country, and Israel has an international development agency before the United States, before Canada, before the United Nations has its development program. It becomes one of the first countries in the world to extend its hand in friendship and support. Now, Israel doesn't have money, so instead of sending money, it sends what Israel's best at, friendship and knowledge. It's sending experts into developing countries to create training programs and bringing individuals from different developing countries to Israel to attend training programs here. And this continues even after the 1967 war and the 1973 war, when the Arab states threatened oil embargoes on countries that retain their political and diplomatic ties with Israel. And even then, Israel goes quiet under the radar, and it continues to be in cooperation with many countries, sending farmers, teachers, engineers, and so forth.
This is fantastic. And of course, this work is still being done today. I know people who are based in Uganda, for example, and working on different projects there. And what's really somewhat depressing in a way, though, is that, of course, Israel has become this huge success story. But these African countries, in my opinion at least, don't seem to have crossed that threshold.
So you're right. The book also profiles about 18 different Israeli organizations that are doing this work in the present day. Some of them I'm sure people have heard of, like IsraAid and Innovation Africa. And there's stories of many other individuals and organizations. And certainly Israel is an unparalleled success story. You can look at other nations that are also about 75, 76 years old, and what Israel has been able to build in that time is quite remarkable. But mark my word, Africa is on the way up, and there's this huge opportunity right now to be in friendship and partnership, and also in business with these nations. They have huge populations, huge potential, and I think the future is very bright for them.
I was last year in Africa for about 10 days or so. And in one of my meetings, I was in the Ministry of Education in its technology department. I asked to use the restroom, and I did. And when I noticed that there was no running water in the bathroom, instead there was a huge vat of water in the corner, and you had to use it to wash your hands or whatever. And I asked my companion, who was taking me around to several African countries, what's going on here? And she said, oh, no, we have running water in the education ministry, in the technology department, just twice a week. And it was such a startling, eye-opening moment, because I just spent an hour speaking with somebody about the highest level of technology, about his time here in Israel, learning at one of the universities here. And yet here we were with the most basic, in my mind, need, running water. And it wasn't being fulfilled.
Absolutely. And one of the remarkable things that I write about in the book is that the solutions can sometimes be so very simple. So Innovation Africa, Sivan Yari, who's the founder of that organization, she was traveling, she was working with the United Nations actually, and she was looking at different projects, and she saw that this issue of having no energy, no electricity was one particular problem. It means that there's no light. No electricity means no light for children to be able to study in the day and at night. It also means that in clinics, you can't refrigerate vaccines. It's very hard to get doctors to come to communities that don't have electricity. And having grown up in Israel, she thought to herself, we have a pretty good solution for electricity, because what's in abundance on the African continent? Sun. And she had this idea to bring solar power to communities and to be able to use them to generate light. But also there's quite a lot of water, but it's deep in aquifers, and you need to have pumps with electricity to bring it to the surface. And so the solar powers that they installed both bring light and electricity to communities, but also enable them to bring this fresh, clean water up to the surface. And it's been a game changer in many different communities.
So the subtitle of your book is Israeli Resilience in the Wake of Disaster. And are you talking about African disaster, or are you talking about our disaster?
So the book was submitted, the manuscript for my book was submitted 6 weeks before October 7th. And then October 7th happened. And as I said, there's some black spaces in my memory. And when I finally returned to the project, I said to the editor that I wanted to rewrite the introduction. And I also wanted to give an opportunity for the people in the book to be able to write a postscript to their chapters, to be able to share what the impact of October 7th has been on them personally and on their work. One of the people that I had written about in the book is somebody who comes from a community that few people would have heard of before October 7th, from Kibbutz Be'eri. And she, along with members of her family, were taken hostage on October 7th to Gaza. Members of her family were murdered. And before October 7th, I had met and interviewed her in the context of a nonprofit that she founded that's working on bringing the best seeds in the world to farmers in Africa. She had been working in the private sector, in the global seed industry. And the global seed industry is actually quite remarkable in the research that goes into figuring out how you can get different seeds to grow in different climates, under different conditions, depending on the heat, the water, and so forth. And the poorest farmers in the world don't have access to them. They're extraordinarily expensive. They also might not know about them because they're in very rural communities. Sometimes it's because they're illiterate. And she wanted to close this gap. And actually, she founded this organization called Fair Planet in order to be able to do that. And it's no small feat to figure it out, because it's not just about handing them the seeds. It's also about teaching them how to be able to grow them and demonstrating that this will yield a better, more successful produce than the seeds that they were already using. And after October 7th, her nonprofit continued to do this work because they were absolutely confident that even in captivity, and as much as they were fighting for her freedom, they knew that she would want the work to continue, that it was her life's mission. And actually, when I finally finished the book and wrote to everybody who was involved in order to thank them, she by now was freed from Gaza after 50 days in captivity and was the first one to write back to wish me Mazel Tov.
Aviva, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan. If you have any comments or questions about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Until next week, Shalom.